Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to welcome tonight Eugene Rogan, who will give a lecture on ending the cycle of violence, prospects for peace, I think, and reconstruction in the Middle East in the 2020s. Sounds a very optimistic title. Eugene Rogan is an American from California. He studied at Columbia and Harvard. He's got his PhD at Harvard. And he gradually moved eastwards. So he went to Oxford in 1991. He's been the professor of modern Middle Eastern history since, I think, 2015, correct? He's the director of the Middle East Center of the University of Oxford and a fellow of St. Antony's College. I didn't know, he told me while we were coming here, that he also spent 5 years of his childhood in Beirut. So, of course, he speaks Arabic, not only because he was in Beirut. Eugene is one of the world's authorities on the Middle East. He has written many books on the subject, covering late Ottoman periods, wars and the history of Palestine. He has a Penguin book, The Arabs, A History, which is now in its 3rd edition, if I remember well. I also found out that 3 of his books had been published in Greek, including his latest one, which just come out, The Damascus Events, the Massacre of 1860, and the End of the Old Ottoman Order. But today he will speak to us more about the present and the future, of course, starting with history. And may I add one thing, is I first met Eugene through his equally famous wife. I said equally famous. Nairi Hoods, who is the founder and dean of the Blavatnik School of Government, and she was one of my former students in the old days of Oxford. So, Eugene, you're more than welcome. We look forward to hearing what you have to say, and hopefully we will leave this room tonight a bit more optimistic than we usually are about the Middle East. It remains to be seen. Okay, Eugene, you have the floor.
Well, Loukas, first of all, thank you so much for the honor of the invitation. It's such a pleasure to be joining you in this ELIAMEP event. And it's wonderful to be back in Athens. And I'm very grateful to my publishers at Alexandria for having made my books available to the Greek readership, which keeps giving me an excuse to return to Athens. So, and yeah, optimism. No, I was going to say we're actually meeting at a moment of heightened anxiety. We have a fragile ceasefire in Gaza that is threatened and undermined by both the Netanyahu government and the Hamas militia in Gaza. So we are glad to see the killing brought to an end after 2 years of what has evolved into a genocidal conflict. But we're very well aware of the dangers that surround this very fragile ceasefire. But it is a moment of opportunity, not just to draw this 2-year conflict to a close, but to take meaningful action to resolve what has been the longest, in a sense, the definitive conflict of a conflict-ridden Middle East. And the question that hangs over this ceasefire is whether or not the international community has the will to invest the diplomatic energy to encourage Israel and Palestine to take the necessary steps to turn this ceasefire into a just and durable peace. That is the challenge. Ceasefire in its own is not enough. Now, while no doubt many of us in this room today believe that the international community should invest that energy. We recognize that in 2025, that international community is very distracted by international crises for Europe, the war in Ukraine, but also by troubles at home, political troubles, the rise of the right in certain European countries, the rise of anti-immigration xenophobia, the economic challenges that European countries are facing.
Troubles at home and crises abroad make it actually a very hard moment for us to look to Europe, North America, the rest of the world.
To invest the energy it takes to try and resolve this crisis. And it's made worse by having an American administration that is no longer bound by an international rules-based. Every time I talk about the Trump administration, I get nervous laughter from an audience, and I don't want to provoke that, because what we see unfolding through the measures, diplomatic or peacemaking, by this administration are just characterized by an unwillingness to work through the institutions of the rule-based order. And so we never know whether the good that they have done today will endure, whether they will stand by it tomorrow, or whether there will be a reversal of policy in an unpredictable way. And so it makes the United States, which has always been central towards Middle East peacemaking, in a sense, less reliable than ever. So it's not an optimal context for decisive action or peacemaking. There are so many challenges. There are so few resources. But being a historian by trade, I think that the first resource we must deploy is a bit of historical context. My tagline as a historian has always been, if you want to understand the mess we're in today, you need to know some history. So, in terms of a historical context, 25 years into the 21st century, I think I can conclude already that this is by far a more violent century than the end of the 20th had proven to be. I say that having been an eyewitness to the last quarter of the 20th century. As Loukas indicated, I spent no small part of my childhood growing up in Beirut in the 1970s until the Civil War got to a turning point and we moved to Cairo. So my last 8 years of high school, I spent in the Eastern Mediterranean, and then as a graduate student, went to Jordan for language training and for my doctoral research. So I saw the Middle East at first hand, up close, in the 1970s and 1980s. And you wouldn't have characterized that region as peaceful. Superpower rivalries of the Cold War had turned the Arab-Israeli conflict into proxy wars between Soviet allies and American allies in the region. My family and I actually took refuge here in Athens in October of 1973, when it was no longer safe to be an American in Beirut because of America's support for Israel. They were taking Americans and shooting them as a symbolic act to demonstrate their anger at America's rearming of Israel in the 73 war. While Israel made peace with Egypt in 1979 in the famous Camp David Accords, the Arab-Israeli conflict continued in other theaters of the Middle East. In Lebanon, for instance, which my family was forced to leave at the end of 1975, Lebanon dissolved in a civil war during which that country would have its own civil war, would be occupied by Syria from the east, from Israel from the south. And Lebanon was not alone. You'll recall in 1982 how Syria was shaken by a Muslim Brotherhood-led insurgency that took Syria to the brink of civil war. Sudan, of course, was to suffer the longest civil war in Africa. Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, launching an 8-year war that we all compared to the trench warfare of the First World War. And though the casualties didn't reach First World War magnitude, 1 million lives were lost in the course of the Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988. The Kurds, of course, launched a civil war in Turkey for their cultural rights. And then in 1990-91, Kuwait became the theater of first an Iraqi occupation and then an international coalition led by the United States in the Desert Storm War of 1991 to liberate Kuwait. So, just to refresh ourselves on recent history, and if we look back to the last quarter of the 20th century, it wasn't a picnic in the Middle East. You wouldn't describe this as a particularly prosperous or peaceful period. So, bearing that in mind, all I can say is the 21st century has taken violence to an unprecedented, I would say unthinkable height from the perspective of the end of the 20th century, the end of the Cold War, the hopes we had invested in a new world order based on peace and conflict resolution. If I look at the shock waves that have struck the Middle East and have really shaped where we are in the 21st century, I will begin with the attacks of September 11, 2001, which, with terrorist attacks on New York, Washington, D.C., and a plane crashing in Pennsylvania, was to take America into a new phase of history called the War on Terror, in which the Americans would be drawn into two major wars. In 2001, they entered Afghanistan. It was to prove America's longest war, though not perhaps with the casualty figures of the Vietnam. It was still a war that once entered upon, the Americans could not find a way out. And 20 years went by before, in chaotic and calamitous conditions, the Americans finally withdrew to hand over to the Taliban in the Biden years. And then, of course, in 2003, the US mounted a smaller coalition with their partner Britain to invade Iraq to topple the regime of Saddam Hussein. So, arguably, the good of toppling the Ba'athist dictatorship brought in the evil of a long American occupation that was imposed on the Iraqi people without concern for their consent, let alone their security, and was going to set off a period of tremendous instability in Iraq, where not just Iraqi-American tensions tore the country apart, but inter-Iraqi communal tensions were to turn Iraq, once a repressive but stable state, into a state of perpetual violence. While America and its allies focused on the war on terror and events such as the train bombings in Madrid or the bombings in central London early in the noughties were to reinforce Europe's sense of being part to an American-led war on terror, the Palestine-Israel conflict reawakens with the outbreak of the Second Intifada, also at the beginning of the 2000s. But instead of the civil resistance of the First Intifada, Palestinian activists take the instruments of terror, of bus bombings and of shootings of civilians, to take the conflict with Israel to a new level of violence. But in the same time, it was to inscribe Palestine and the Palestinian movement in the American worldview and that of its allies as in some way being a part of the war on terror. So Israel was a victim of terror like America was a victim of terror, which meant that no one was taking Palestinian legitimate demands as seriously as they should be because they were tarred by association through the terror methods of the Second Intifada. And in the process, the 1993 Oslo Accords were left to wither and die. Every building that the European Union invested in the course of the Oslo process systematically destroyed by the Israelis as they wrought revenge on the Palestinians for the Second Intifada. The 2000s were aptly described by Lebanese journalist and author Samir Kassir as a period of an Arab malaise. The inability to act to bring about change in their own countries as citizens, dissatisfied with their failing autocratic rulers, but also unable to prevent foreign powers from acting on the Arab states without their consent. So the Arabs felt themselves in the 2000s in a new period of total powerlessness, pawns on the chessboard while someone else is playing the game. The emblem or the symbol of that powerlessness would be an unknown vegetable seller in the small town of Tunisia, Sidi Boussaid, Mohammed Bouazizi, in Sidi it's not Sidi Bouaziz, Sidi Bouaziz. But Mohammed Bouazizi, the young vegetable seller, who in frustration against government injustice, bureaucracy, the failure of the social contract, sets himself on fire. And in so doing, captured the resentments and the angers of people right across the Arab world. And such an unlikely event which set off a chain of popular uprisings that would one by one topple the deeply entrenched autocratic governments of Tunisia, of Egypt, of Yemen, of Libya. The wave of popular uprisings across the Middle East and North Africa that we came to call the Arab Spring. Now, popular action had the power to topple autocrats. But the demonstrators were not organized enough politically to be able to fill the power vacuum that they created. And so, if the war on terror coming after 2001 was the first shockwave to bring a new level of violence to the Middle East, I'm afraid that in spite of all the high hopes we invested in the Arab Spring, of legitimate popular uprisings seeking the end of autocracy, the Arab Spring was to have the consequence of unleashing a second wave of massive violence across the Arab world. In Egypt, the army ultimately returned to power in 2013 with the election of Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Elsewhere, Arab Spring revolutions left power vacuums filled by men with guns. It's the tragedy of the Arab Spring that when the people rose up, they couldn't put in power men and women of ideas. Power always was filled by men with guns. In Libya, for instance, where post-Gaddafi Libya dissolved into a civil war. Or in Yemen, where the Houthi militia from the north of Yemen displaced the government in Sana'a, taking Yemen into civil conflict, later into a regional conflict, when Saudi Arabia and the UAE intervened in Yemen, taking Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the region, to the deepest humanitarian crisis at that point in history. In Syria, where most of the military remained loyal to the regime and where popular protest degenerated into the most murderous civil war in Middle Eastern history. We still live today in the aftershocks of the instability unleashed by the Arab Spring. Tunisia has abandoned its constitution and has gone under the autocracy of President Kais Saied. Sudan, in what we might call Arab Spring Mark II, rose up in 2019 popular protests demanding the end of the autocracy and, having learned from previous experience, the end of the military's role in politics. But the military ultimately rejected that pact. And we now see Sudan divided between the commander of the army and the commander of one of the most violent militias, who are now engaged in a civil war that has taken Sudan down the pathway to genocide and to what is now eclipsed Yemen as the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world today. And then you have government paralysis in the very fragile states like Lebanon or Iraq or Algeria, where popular uprisings pressing for change run into very fragile governments that no one quite wants to bring down for fear of the consequences, but where the prospects of rebuilding economy, society, politics have been more or less put on hold. So, war on terror, Arab Spring. In addition to these two, I would add one further development that contributed to the fragility of the Arab world and the increase in violence in the 21st century. And that would be a phenomenon known as the axis of resistance. Now, many regional powers have come to exercise more and more influence on regional affairs in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly as American administrations, really starting with Obama and then going through Trump and Biden and back to Trump again, have tried to withdraw America from the position they took in the Middle East in the aftermath of 9/11, end the never-ending wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, get American troops out of Syria. And this has created the space for regional actors who have very real interests in other countries in the region to try and intervene more effectively. Saudi Arabia, for instance, promoting conservative Salafi movements in Arab politics. Or Turkey, extending influence through those movements associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. Israel used its military might to intervene where neighbors crossed its interests. But none could match Iran's region-wide penetration through allied states and militias that it referred to as the axis of resistance. And I can only assume it's an ironic name that was applied in response to America referring to an axis of evil. No evil here, Iran would say, resistance. Resistance to American domination applied through their proxy in the region, Israel, in effect. But in the course of the 20th century, this axis has taken shape, and its key actors are well known to you. Let's start with Hezbollah in Lebanon. Obviously, the ties between Iran and Hezbollah are of longer standing than the 21st century. They go back to the 1980s and deeper yet to the ties between Shiite communities of Lebanon and Iran, who would go to Iran for study. And in the 1980s, in the course of the 20th century, Hezbollah worked very closely with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. They also wound up stockpiling an impressive arsenal of weapons that they received from Iran, allowed them to apply pressure on Israel, basically serving as Iran's proxy in pressuring their enemy, Israel, through Lebanon. So Hezbollah is going to be one very important element of the axis of resistance. But Syria, too, another element of that axis of very long standing. Here we could trace the origins of Syria's special relationship to Iran back to the Iran-Iraq War. So divided were the rival Ba'athist states of Syria and Iraq that Syria chose to side with Iran, not an Arab state, against their neighbor Iraq in the Iran-Iraq War. And this was the beginning of a deepening relationship of mutual support between Iran and Syria. But that would take a particularly important turn after 2011, when the Arab Spring came to Syria, and what started as civil protest movements degenerated into, as I said before, a terribly violent fratricidal civil war, in which Iran's support was to prove very important in relieving the war-weary Syrian army by the deployment of IRGC troops who brought a degree of discipline and of commitment that really helped Syrian forces to sustain their crushing of the uprising in Syria. So Syria is an important part of the axis of resistance. And then coming back to Yemen and the Houthis, again, we must remember, though everyone says the Shiite Houthis, the Houthis are Zaydi Shiites, they're Seveners. They are a different theological branch of Shia Islam from Iran. They actually don't have a common worldview. This is a marriage of convenience. It works for Iran to support the Houthis because it gives them a point of pressure on their rival in the region, Saudi Arabia, through its southern frontier. And it comes at very little cost to Iran, but with great benefits. And we have seen the Houthis come to play more and more of a role of supporting Iranian policies since 2023, when by sending missiles occasionally against Israel or by acting against shipping transiting through the Red Sea, the Houthis have been able to apply pressure on Israel in partnership with Iran that made them an important part of the axis. And lastly, and perhaps most surprising, Hamas. Hamas is a Sunni movement that emerged from the Palestinian Muslim Brotherhood. So absolutely zero ideological or theological connection to the Islamic Republic of Iran. But it is, again, a proxy which, through limited material assistance as far as I know, but extensive moral support, and by Iran's mobilizing in support of Hamas's actions against Israel to try and bring pressure against Israel, The support that Iran has given Hamas has made it an element of the axis of resistance. To this can be added those pro-Iranian factions in Iraq, whose work is in some ways constrained by the unpopularity among most Iraqis of being seen as in some way controlled by Iran. There is a nationalist streak in Iraq that makes it unacceptable for parties to be advocating Iranian policies at the interest of over the interests of Iraq. So there's a limit, but the very fact that the dominant political leadership in Iraq is Shia has converted Iraq's position in regional affairs to be more, as it were, supportive of Iran's. Now, Western governments have been very critical of Iran's influence and of the axis of resistance in particular. But objectively viewed, it is a reasonable means to extend Iran's influence and pressure its rivals, countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, as well as its enemies, the United States and Israel, at a relatively low cost, while Iran's isolation under sanctions limits its options. Having witnessed regime change on two of its borders, the Iranians watched the Americans topple the Taliban in Afghanistan and topple Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And they have no doubt that if there were an opportunity, the Israelis or the Americans would be very glad to topple them too. So the axis of resistance to me is not about extremism or an extension of the Shi'i-driven ideology of the mad mullahs of the Islamic Republic. It is pure pragmatism. It is realpolitik, and it should be taken in that way. But the axis of resistance has proven very destabilizing to the Middle East and North Africa. For instance, Hezbollah has played a spoiler role in Lebanese politics in preventing the formation of governments, and Hezbollah has, on more than one occasion, drawn Lebanon into unwanted wars with Israel that have had devastating consequences for Lebanon. So Hezbollah's role, whatever it means for Iran, has been very compromising for Lebanon's stability. Similarly, Yemen under the Houthis has been devastated by civil and regional war. As we said, at the second decade of the 21st century, the deepest humanitarian crisis in the world. Syria, the support of Iran sustained the cruel Ba'athist regime, applying the most inhumane methods, leading to over 500,000 Syrian deaths in the course of their civil war. It would not have been possible to sustain the Syrian resistance to the popular opposition without Iran's support. And Hamas, well, Hamas would crown 16 years of misgovernment in the Gaza Strip with an unprecedented assault on Israel that would unleash Israel's longest and most violent war of them all. So to say that the axis of resistance is pragmatic or realpolitik is not to discount the fact that it has been hugely destabilizing to the Middle East as a region. Now, the events of 7 October 2023 are still so familiar to all of us. They're still of such recent memory that I don't need to remind us of the Hamas atrocities against the Israeli military and civilians on that day, or the 2 years of war Israel has prosecuted on the densely inhabited Gaza Strip, which the UN itself has declared to be a genocide. With the conclusion of the ceasefire last week, we're now entering a post-conflict phase fraught with dangers, as I said at the outset, but also with opportunities. So here, Loukas, perhaps a bit of optimism might creep in. Israel's wars since the 7th of October have transformed the political landscape beyond Gaza. The most recent Israeli war with Hezbollah in Lebanon killed hundreds of militiamen by booby-trapped pagers and walkie-talkies, and decapitated Hezbollah's leadership, going right up to its very charismatic leader, Hassan Nasrallah. His assassination effectively took away the meaningful leadership of Hezbollah. This was followed by a ground war in Lebanon, during which Israeli forces were able to systematically destroy, I assume, Hezbollah's arsenal. I assume because, of course, Israel has kept the area under its occupation very firmly closed to outside eyes, but they've been there a long time. They've been working through the tunnels. If they haven't systematically destroyed the arsenal, then Israel's army is far less capable than we give it credit to be. So let us assume that it has broken the power of Hezbollah. But in so doing, it broke Hezbollah's power over Lebanese politics. And since this devastating war, very high casualties in Lebanon. Nonetheless, Lebanon has been able to elect a president, Joseph Aoun. They've been able to agree on the formation of a government led by Nawaf Salem. It is a very good government. I was in Beirut in May. Journalist friends and academic colleagues were all unanimous in saying this is probably the best government Lebanon has seen in 25, 30 years. So there is a prospect, unintended consequence of Israel's wars in Lebanon that could lead to a more stable Lebanon. Similarly, the defeat of Hezbollah critically weakened the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. Remember, Russian troops had already been withdrawn from Syria to fight the war in Ukraine. But with the decapitation of Hezbollah and the way that Hezbollah was forced back into Lebanon to try and defend their position against the Israeli onslaught, the critical support they provided to the regime in Syria, along with the loss of support from Russia, was really all it took to leave the regime indefensible. And when opposition forces broke out of their enclave in Idlib to lay siege to Aleppo, the city fell in almost no time at all. And then they began their very rapid descent through Homs and Hama. Damascus fell without resistance, as Bashar and his cronies sought refuge in Russia and other friendly countries. The leader of that movement, of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a man by the name of Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, took off his fatigues, put on a suit, trimmed his beard, and called himself Ahmed al-Shar'a, and is now representing Syria as its interim president, and is persuading the international community that his intention is to provide a safe country for Syrians to return to, and a country that would be safe to invest in reconstruction. But we know that there have been sectarian violence among Christian communities in Syria, much worse among Alawi communities in Banyas and Tartus, and most recently against Druze communities. That demonstrates the very fragile nature of this transition moment in Syria. But there is the possibility, after 12 years of the most murderous civil war, for a Syria safe for Syrians. Let's keep that hope in mind. And Iran itself came under sustained attack, first by Israel, later aided by the United States, targeting its nuclear facilities, but also commanders of the IRGC and nuclear scientists. The 12-day war left Iran weaker and more isolated, but it's unlikely that the axis of resistance will ever be rebuilt. While these are positive developments in the bid to restore peace and stability to the Middle East, we have to acknowledge the extent of the destruction across the region to appreciate the magnitude of the challenge of reconstruction. Libya remains divided between governments in Benghazi and Tripoli, and both those cities have been devastated by warfare. Syria is under this fragile government I just described, with its sectarian violence. And again, you know the images of what Baba Amr quarter in Homs looks like, what eastern Aleppo looks like. As you move through the topography of Syria, the destroyed cities present a reconstruction challenge that's almost unimaginable. And Yemen remains divided between the Houthi-led government in Sana'a, the internationally recognized government in Aden, and again, no real efforts yet to help bring that country out of its humanitarian crisis. And Sudan, as already suggested, remains locked in a genocidal war between the rapid deployment forces and the Sudanese army, with no end in sight. And then there's Gaza. And then, God help us, there's Gaza. After 2 years of intensive warfare, that's left at least 68,000 known deaths, thousands more unknown, bodies trapped in the rubble of collapsed buildings, hundreds of thousands of injured, millions with post-traumatic stress disorders. God help us for Gaza. 80% of the built structure of Gaza destroyed. Reconstruction has been estimated at $80 billion. I think that's an optimistic figure when one sees the images, as we all have, of the devastation. And of course, it doesn't look like that by coincidence. Gaza looks like that by plan. In such a setting, optimists go hungry in search of nourishment for hope. But there is a pathway forward if the international community perseveres in seeing the process through to a durable solution. And resolving the region's oldest and deepest conflict would provide a fundamental basis in addressing all the other conflicts that have so shredded the Middle East. The 2023-25 Gaza conflict has demonstrated beyond doubt that the Israel-Palestine conflict will not resolve itself. Israelis and Palestinians will not make peace, just the two of them. We know that. Both sides need pushing and support to get there. And we know the status quo is untenable. It gave us the 7th of October. It gave us the Gaza genocide. So the status quo is not a solution. There are certain hard realities that we all know to be true and should guide us in our thinking, lest what I'm about to say to you sounds wildly optimistic. I insist, this is pragmatism. Demographically speaking, Israelis and Palestinians are more or less at parity. That is to say, Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs. They're both about populations of about 7.2 million each. 7.3 million. By some counts, if you add Arab citizens of Israel, Arabs in East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza, it might even exceed the number of Israeli Jews. But I think it's enough for our purposes to say they're at parity. That's the demographic reality. Now, there's only 3 pathways forward. And again, I'm not saying this ironically, but these are your 3 options in a situation of 2 populations of equal size that aspire to control the same small territory. One is extermination. It is genocide. One side kills all of the other side. And that once sounded like an absurd proposition. But as the international community has increasingly called out Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocide, we have to say that one of the lessons we take away from the war of the past 2 years is that the international community will not accept genocide as a solution. They will intervene diplomatically to prevent genocide. The second option is expulsion, ethnic cleansing. You drive everyone out of the territory of the other side. This is something with deep historic resonance. After the First World War, the population transfers between Greece and Turkey were seen as a humanitarian solution to prevent communal conflict between incompatible peoples. Okay? We all know it was a violence, and we would later come to call that violence ethnic cleansing. But the notions of population transfers has always lingered over Palestine, Israel, going right back to the Peel Commission report in 1937. It's been out there. But we've seen the reaction, and please don't laugh, to Trump's Riviera plan, which was based on the complete depopulation of the Gaza Strip. And the international community said, no, that would be ethnic cleansing. That is a crime against humanity. So I would like to say that coming out of the experience of the Gaza war, we can eliminate expulsion as a way forward. So the only option left on the table, dear audience, is cohabitation. It is living together. It is 7.2 million Palestinian Arabs living next to 7.2 million Jewish Israelis. This is the only legal and ethical solution. But on what terms? The 7th of October revealed the contradiction of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territory. If you keep the land, you keep the people. And so you sacrifice your security by creating conditions that produce violent opposition. And I will remind you that Hamas is an acronym. Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya. The M in the middle of it is Muqawama. The word means opposition. And you may destroy Hamas, but some other party will rise up to fill the opposition. In the same way that the PLO was once the forbidden terrorist organization that no one could talk to, and then became the tamed party of the Oslo process, you may destroy Hamas, but Muqawama, resistance or opposition to occupation, never. There are two visions of cohabitation without occupation. There is the binational state, where all enjoy the same rights and responsibilities. Now, I can see the appeal of the binational state, in which all share the territory of Israel and Palestine equally. I mean, let's be honest. If the populations are at parity, then really they should have 50-50 access to the land. What we're looking at now is an occupation where Israel is 78% of the territory of historic Palestine, Mandate Palestine, and the Palestinians are constricted to 22%. It's not a great deal. I mean, the binational state, which would give everyone equal access to all of Israel-Palestine, is in every ways the better solution. But nationalism's getting in the way, and I can't see the nationalism going away. The binational state is the death of Zionism. And I know few Israelis that are willing to accept the death of Zionism with what it implies. That one day, through democratic means, the Prime Minister of Israel's name is going to be Muhammad. So I can't see how to achieve the ideal of the binational state. What is our other solution? It is Palestinian statehood. And what we have seen is the international community putting their weight behind Palestinian statehood in 2025. I mean, this is a position Greece has taken long ago. But many Western European countries, out of their support of Israel, have resisted doing so until 2025. The same applies to Canada or Australia. But these countries that are long-standing friends and supporters of Israel, looking at a situation that borders between genocide and ethnic cleansing, believe that we have to move beyond this conflict in a just and enduring way, and they put their policy behind Palestinian statehood. You can call it a two-state solution if you like. I would also add that Israel and Palestine have been changed by the events of the past 2 years. And in this, we may see that there will be changes that come in both Israel and Palestine. Obviously, there is no hope for achieving Palestinian statehood while the Netanyahu government is in power. It is committed to preventing Palestinian statehood. And the right-wing settler parties that are essential to sustaining this coalition bolt merely at the idea of a ceasefire, let alone of compromising their claims to Judea, Samaria. They'd like the Gaza Strip. But the Netanyahu government has isolated Israel in the international community. That makes Israelis of all political positions uncomfortable. They don't like seeing their old friends and enemies accusing them of genocide or recognizing Palestine at their expense. Israeli society is also divided over the conduct of the war. The government's failure to move quickly to secure the safe release of hostages taken by Hamas. And then go back to changes to the constitution, to the composition of the Supreme Court that divided Israelis even before the 7th of October. Or demands for a public inquiry into the failure of the Israeli state to provide security against an event like the 7th of October. Israelis are only beginning to come to terms with what they've done in Gaza, and they're very uncomfortable. The never again nation finding itself confronting accusations of genocide, but being accused rather than the victims. This is placing Israelis into just the beginning of a public debate that has been muted by the ways in which Israelis have responded to the threat against their security by moving to the right, and they have. Public opinion polls really suggest that there's very little center left to Israeli politics. Israel has really moved to the right. But there is this lingering doubt about where Israel has been, what it has done. And I think that we'll see a debate open within Israel among thinkers and intellectuals that will be part of coming to terms with the violence, coming to terms with the post October 7. So it's not impossible to imagine in the coming year an opposition movement that could actually win the vote of Israeli voters. In the end, it'll take Israeli voters to dictate a change in Israeli policy. We can't force that on Israel. It's enough of a democracy, and it's a proud democracy. That the idea that we could force Israel to do something against its government or its people's wishes, I don't think is true. But I do think an opposition could present Israeli voters with a changed path. And I think we should be working with everyone in Israel who wants to see a vision of two states at peace with each other, so that the Israelis will find a pathway forward. And I think Palestine too has changed. We sense the people of Gaza holding Hamas to account for provoking a genocidal war that's cost the people of Gaza literally everything. The failures of Mahmoud Abbas, of the Palestinian Authority, to protect their people against such violence, and not just in Gaza, in the West Bank. And then the perception of corruption, or that the PA is really there to serve Israel's security interests rather than the needs of the Palestinian people. No, change is coming to Palestine. Change has to come to Palestine. Palestine needs a government with a mandate if they are to fulfill the hope and potential of the statehood that has been conferred, or recognition conferred on them by new friends in the international community. Now, looking over the devastated landscape of Palestine and the broader Middle East, it's easy to succumb to despair. But looking at some of the positive transformations, the new governments in Syria and in Lebanon, Iran's retreat, international recognition of Palestine as a tangible step towards resolving the conflict, and popular demands for political change in Israel, in Palestine, you can just make out a pathway forward. It certainly isn't straight, and it's very narrow. There will be risks every step of the way. Yet as the experiences of other war-torn, deeply divided societies has demonstrated, and just think of France and Germany, 3 wars they killed each other in, from the 1870s through the Second World War, or the United States and Japan, again, deeply divided enemies in World War II, the greatest of allies by the end of the 20th century. We know it can be done. Deeply divided societies can come together as neighbors and allies. It will not be quick. Political and physical and social and economic reconstruction is a project that will take decades. So it will require patience and application. There's no quick fix. But by ending a vicious cycle of never-ending wars, constructive measures can reverse a vicious cycle into a virtuous one. I believe that fundamentally. We can turn around the death spiral that the Middle East has been in right through the last 25 years by solving one fundamental problem. And from those foundations, reverse the vicious cycle into a virtuous one to address the other reconstruction challenges of the region. That's the only reason why the next steps we in the international community must take following on the ceasefire in Gaza are so important, and why this moment we are living today is truly a historic one. Thank you.
It was a true tour de force, but we didn't expect anything less from you. Let me ask 1 or 2 questions, perhaps the second one in a slightly provocative manner, and then we open the floor. First of all, you referred to the Saddam Hussein Iraq as a repressive but stable state. Isn't that true of most Arab states today? Repressive but stable? That's my first question, which is not provocative. The second one is you ended up by speaking more about Israel's shift to the right, about a government that is now accused of genocide, and the implications for Israeli public opinion, but also implications for international community. Okay. Now, for me as an outsider and not an expert on the Middle East like you, one of the fundamental things that come out is in the Middle East is the huge imbalance between the two sides, between Israel and the Arabs. It's a huge imbalance, militarily so, economically less so. You have essentially Israel that has emerged as a regional superpower. And Israel remains a regional superpower as long as the United States government tolerates that. Now, you spoke diplomatically, you're not a diplomat, politely about international community. But when it comes down to Israel, international community, the only thing that counts is the US. The rest doesn't count because until Biden or Trump, now Trump, intervenes, however many states in Europe and the rest of the world recognize the Palestinian state, the Israeli prime minister and much of Israeli public opinion doesn't give two hoots. So it's only when Trump intervenes, then it changes. So is your term international community a polite way of saying US? That's the provocative question.
Not provocative at all. It really goes to the heart of the issue. But I'm going to take your questions in order. You're absolutely right when one talks about oppressive but stable. That has been the standard of Arab politics since independence. And I think, I would lay a lot of the blame on the way in which the military has come to play such an important role in Arab politics in every country that experienced a revolution. It's interesting that, the Arab Spring did not take place in monarchies. The brief exception of Bahrain, quite specific reasons. And some people said, oh, it's because monarchy is so legitimate in the Arab world. That's probably true. But I think what's more the explanation is that those are countries where the army is out of politics entirely. And the exceptions were the revolutionary republics where officers overthrew kings, like in Egypt or in Iraq. But that culture of the military and politics says that officers give orders and subalterns obey. And a private never says to a captain, I disagree with you, sir, or my political philosophy differs from yours, sir. You will be punished very severely. If you take it to extremes, they'll kill you. They can. And that culture in politics is the death of critical thinking, of political freedoms. And it is the norm in the Arab world. But that was precisely what Arab Spring demonstrations was challenging. They recognized that the social contract that had been introduced in that enthusiastic moment of the 1950s and 60s of Arab socialism failed, and now was entrenching autocrats who were passing presidency to their sons and were enriching only a small group around them. And they rose for a different kind of politics. They haven't gotten it yet. But it's very interesting to see that even after the 2011 Arab Spring, you had the Hirak movement in Algeria in 2017. You had the Lebanese You Stink movement that emerged challenging the political elites of Lebanon. You had the tragic uprising in Sudan. You also had a major anti-sectarian popular uprising in Iraq. There was a kind of second wave of the people demanding change to the structures of government. I never give up hope on Arab peoples. You could say it's blind optimism, and again, I'm going to claim pragmatism, because everywhere the Arabs have gone in exile, they succeed to the highest degree. They're the best businessmen, they're the best doctors, they're the best scientists. They're amazing. Palestinians, Lebanese, Iraqis, Iranians, not Arabs, but Middle Easterners, Turks. Put them in diaspora, they succeed to the highest level. I know these people. I fundraise from them to do the activities of our Middle East Center in Oxford. They thrive everywhere except in their own countries. Imagine if they had governments that unleashed the human capital of the Arab peoples. what they would be capable of. So I give hope that eventually the virtuous people will be organized enough to have the ideas to fill the power vacuum they create and move on to representative government. That too can happen in the 21st century. It doesn't have to be the death spiral. But the international community comes into the question. And you're a devil, Loukas, for putting it this way. Deeply disempowering of important global players other than the United States. What I think is so interesting about this moment is that Europe and Canada, Australia, let's just call them the West, even though they're geographically not that, has for the first time broken with an American consensus to pursue a policy of their own. They've never done that before. And they chose their time well, because the thing about Mr. Trump is he may have a policy that's going in this direction today, but he could change tomorrow and go in that direction. He does it regularly. And before you know it, he's going in that direction. I've seen Tomahawk missiles promised to Ukraine and then withdrawn from Ukraine. I've seen Zelensky insulted and kicked out of the White House. I've seen him invited back 2 times. So I think that period where the Western world looks to American leadership and constancy is broken by Trump. And that means that now perhaps the players in Europe are more important and influential than ever. And let's just think about those who respect their treaty commitments, like the signatories of the Treaty of Rome, who are required by having signed that treaty to act on the arrest warrant for former Defense Secretary Gallant and current Prime Minister Netanyahu. My Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, not the strongest in standing up against Israel, has said that were Netanyahu to come to Britain, they'd have to arrest him because they have a treaty commitment to do so. Think about how that restricts the movement of the Prime Minister of Israel. Even flying to the United Nations. Very amusing to see the flight path he had to take. So I hear you about how...
Went through Greece.
Thank you, Greece. But things are changing, and I think Europe may actually have the potential. But what a terrible moment for this European potential when I watch a French president who can't make a government that withstands a vote of confidence, or where a German chancellor is looking over his shoulder at the advance of Alternative for Deutschland. You know, there's timing to these things. But I think the international community of the West, excluding the United States, has shown a willingness and an ability to make a difference. And I feel like we should keep the pressure up to make them deliver.
I hope you're right.